Welcome to the Cultivate3D Elevator Naked assembly video. To complete this assembly, you'll require a number of tools. Please refer to the supplementary documentation for more information. Locate 8 of the 3D brackets that will become part of the corners of the printer. Also locate the 2 internal L brackets. These will become part of the electronics enclosure frame. Insert the 3D brackets as shown to assemble the frame sides. Insert the 2 L brackets into the single shorter electronics enclosure 30/30 extrusion and slide it into place as shown. Now complete the frame by sliding each side into place and secure each 3D bracket with 4 grub screws. Also secure each L bracket with 2 grub screws. Locate each of the acrylic corner braces and install them as shown. Use M3 10mm screws with large M3 hammer nuts. Insert them into the frame and allow the hammer nuts to rotate as you tighten the screws. Repeat the process for each of the corner braces. Please note, the electronics enclosure does not have corner braces. Attach the end stop to the servo mount using 2 M2 12mm screws. Assemble the left and right blocker assemblies using M5 30mm screws and 25mm aluminium spacers. Note the M5 30mm screws should securely self-tap into the acrylic blocker mounts. Fix the blocker mounts to the servo mount using M3 16mm screws with star washers front and back secured with M3 nylock nuts. Assemble and fix the servo vertical position stops into position as shown using M5 20mm screws into 6.35mm aluminium spacers, followed by star washers front and back secured with M5 nylock nuts. Assemble the 2 top and 2 bottom axle assemblies as shown. First insert an eccentric nut into the position shown for the top 2 axles only. Use M5 90mm screws on top and M5 80mm screws on the bottom 2 axles. Insert as shown through the acrylic frame, followed by 3 M5 washers, a 25mm spacer, Delrin dual V-wheel, 18mm spacer, and 3 more M5 washers. Repeat this for both sides. For the moment, it may help to temporarily secure a few nuts to the back of these assemblies to hold them together. Insert the servo as shown with M3 10mm screws and washers. These screws should self-tap. Apply sufficient force while screwing to ensure a clean thread is cut, and don't over-tighten. Attach the servo horn to the hot end rotator with 2 M3 8mm screws. Again, these screws should self-tap into the servo horn. Don't over-tighten. Using the screws provided with your hot ends, secure the mosquito hot ends to the acrylic rotators using the 2.5mm screws as shown. Now insert each of the push fit adapters into the hot end as shown. These will self-tap into place. Ensure adequate downward pressure is applied when screwing them into position in order to allow the push fit adapters to cut a clean thread. Attach the hot end fans as shown with M2.5 16mm screws. Insert the completed hot end rotator onto the servo axle and secure with a single M3 12mm screw. Insert a captive M3 nut into the slot on the top of the servo mount. Assemble the cable chain mount on top with the cross brace underneath as shown with 2 4mm nylon spacers and M3 16mm screws secured on the underside with M3 nylock nuts. Secure the cross brace to the servo mount as shown using an M3 10mm screw into the previously positioned captive nut. Remove the temporary nuts from each of the axles and slide over the rear acrylic brace. Insert 2 eccentric nuts into the top positions, followed by an M5 nylock nut on each side. Assemble the cable chain guide with an M5 35mm screw and 25mm nylon spacer. Insert through the hole in the top of the rear acrylic brace and secure with an M5 nylock nut. Use 2 M3 standard nuts as standoffs to space the blower fan from the rear acrylic brace. Secure to the acrylic brace with 2 M3 25mm screws. Insert and glue the lockline adapter to the blower fan as shown. Then attach 2 lockline tubes. You may need to remove some segments from the lockline tube. When assembling the hot ends and inserting the thermistors and heater cartridges, ensure the wires for each hot end protrude towards the middle of the assembly. This means that each hot end will need to have the cables protruding on opposite sides. Insert the completed Medusa onto the X-axis maker slide rail. Gently rotate the eccentric nuts on the front and back of Medusa to tighten the assembly to the rail. Ensure the eccentric nuts are adjusted equally. The assembly should slide smoothly with no slop. We will now assemble the left and right sides of the Y-axis rails. Repeat the following steps for the opposite side. Attach the inner Y plate to the maker slide rail as shown using M5 12mm screws. Insert 4 eccentric nuts into the innermost side of the inner Y plate as shown. Through these, insert M5 55mm screws, followed by M5 washer, Delrin dual V-wheel and 15mm nylon spacer. Assemble the Y belt termination points to the acrylic outer Y plate as shown using M5 25mm screws, secured with M5 nylock nuts. Complete the assembly by attaching the outer Y plate to the rest of the carriage as shown using an eccentric nut on each screw, followed by nylock nuts to secure the assembly. Repeat on the other side. Insert a small M5 hammer nut onto a M5 12mm screw and attach to the Y rail as shown. This will be the front of the Y rail. Assemble the front Y rail pulley as shown using an M5 55mm screw, M5 25mm nylon spacer through the acrylic front Z carriage, followed by a 5mm nylon spacer, 2 F605Z bearings installed small face to small face, secured with an M5 nylock nut. Assemble the 2 front Z Delrin wheel assemblies as shown with M5 30mm screws through the acrylic front Z carriage, followed by an eccentric nut, Delrin single V-wheel and again secured with an M5 nylock nut. For the Z belt termination point, use an M5 25mm screw through the acrylic front Z carriage as shown, secured with an M5 nylock nut. Attach the assembly to the Y rail as shown with M5 12mm screws and small M5 hammer nuts. Slide the Y belt brace onto the assembly as shown. Fit a large NEMA 17 motor to the acrylic rear Z carriage with 4 M3 10mm screws with washers, then attach a GT2 20-tooth pulley to the shaft, securing with a grub screw in the side of the GT2 pulley to the flat of the shaft. Insert 3 M5 12mm screws through the acrylic rear Z carriage and loosely attach small M5 hammer nuts to the other side. Assemble the rear Z wheel assemblies as shown with pan head M5 30mm screws through each single V Delrin wheel, followed by an eccentric nut. Secure to the acrylic rear Z carriage with M5 nylock nuts. Now attach the assembly to the Y rail as shown, ensuring each hammer nut has rotated in the slot to form a secure fixing. Repeat for the other side. Attach the X cable chain to the front left Y carriage as shown using 2 M3 10mm self-tapping screws. Unscrew the 2 M3 10mm screws shown here on the Medusa to fix the other end of the cable chain to the Medusa carriage. You may need to reverse the end links of the cable chain. They should pry apart with a screwdriver. Also reverse the first 2 to 3 links closest to the Medusa to allow the cable chain to fall onto the Y rail. Finally attach the acrylic Y belt braces. These will prevent the termination points from flexing outwards when the belt is under tension. Measure and cut the length of the Y belts. The belt should run around the motor shaft and opposite pulley, meeting back at the termination points in the middle of the Y plates. Cut the belts around 10 cm longer than required. Secure each end of the Y belt with 2 small zip ties. The extra belt will give you something to grip onto when tensioning the belt. You can trim the extra off later. Repeat the process for both sides. Now may be a good time to start running the hot end cables through the X cable chain. You can flip the top sides of the cable chain links to allow access for running the cables. You can now angle the completed XYZ carriage assembly into the printer frame. Loosen the screws attaching the front and rear Z wheel assemblies to the Y rails. Once inside the frame, move the assemblies back into position so the wheels make good contact with the center slot in the vertical 30-30 extrusions. Rotate the eccentric nuts to fine-tune the wheel tension to the frame. Assemble the Z belt termination points as shown with M5 30mm screws through 25mm nylon spacers into flat T-slot nuts as shown. Don't worry too much about the position now, these can easily be adjusted later. Attach the X motor to the X motor mount with 4 M3 10mm screws. Fix a 20-tooth GT2 pulley to the motor shaft as before, fixing in position to the shaft with small grub screws. Insert 4 M5 12mm screws through the X motor mount. Loosely attach a small M5 hammer nut to each screw as shown and insert the assembly onto the X rails. As before, fix the assembly in place, ensuring the hammer nuts all rotate in the slot. Insert 2 M5 12mm screws through the acrylic XY cable chain mount with small M5 hammer nuts and fix into position as shown. Attach the X end stop as shown with an M3 10mm screw and M3 hammer nut. Assemble the X idler by first attaching the acrylic part to the frame using 2 M5 12mm screws with small M5 hammer nuts. Assemble the idler pulley with an M5 25mm screw through the acrylic part, followed by a washer and 2 F605Z bearings face to face as shown. Secure with an M5 nylock nut. Cut to length the X belt and attach to the Medusa carriage using the same method as the Y belts. Make sure you leave around 10 cm of extra belt which can be trimmed later. Now may be a good time to run the Y motor / end stop cables through the cable chains. Assemble both the rear Z cable chains as shown using 20-20 corner brackets, M5 20mm screws with nylock nuts going through the corner bracket and cable chain, and M5 8mm screw with T-slot nut to fix the top of the cable chain assembly to the Y rail. For the lower part of the cable chain, remove the end termination link. This time insert an M5 20mm screw through the hole in the side of the cable chain, again securing with an M5 nylock nut. Secure the lower cable chain assembly to the printer frame as shown. Assemble 12 20-20 corner brackets as shown with M5 8mm screws and large M5 hammer nuts. Secure each of the corner brackets in the position shown before attaching the assembly to the printer frame. Attach a 30-30 corner bracket to the front Z motor mount as shown with M5 16mm screws secured with a nylock nut. Insert an M5 12mm screw through the base of the corner bracket with a large M5 hammer nut on the other side. Insert M5 16mm screws through the holes in the NEMA 23 motor as shown to mount it to the front motor mount. Secure with M5 nylock nuts. Secure an 8mm bore 20-tooth pulley to the NEMA 23 motor and secure with grub screws. Attach a 30-30 corner bracket to the back Z motor mount as shown with an M5 16mm screw secured with a nylock nut. Insert an M5 12mm screw through the base of the corner bracket with a large M5 hammer nut on the other side. Attach the brake hub to the Z motor's rear shaft and secure with included grub screws. Attach the brake housing to the motor with M4 16mm screws as shown. Assemble two transfer rod braces as follows. Attach a 20-20 corner bracket to the acrylic transfer rod brace with an M5 16mm screw and nylock nut. Insert an M5 12mm screw with large hammer nut to the other side of the corner bracket to be attached to the printer frame later. Insert and hot glue an F608 bearing as shown to the transfer rod brace. Assemble two Z bearing mounts in mirror to one another as shown using two M5 12mm screws and large hammer nuts. Again, glue an F608 ZZ bearing into the Z bearing mount. To the left side of the 8mm transfer rod, first slide on an 8mm bore 32-tooth GT2 pulley and belt, followed by a completed transfer rod brace. Two 8mm bore 20-tooth GT2 pulleys as shown, followed by a completed Z bearing mount. To the right side of the rod, first slide on a completed transfer rod brace, followed by two more 20-tooth GT2 pulleys installed in the opposite direction as the other side, and finally the other Z bearing mount. The entire assembly can now be attached to the printer frame as shown, ensuring all hammer nuts have rotated in their respective slots. Attach an end stop assembly to both the rear left and right Y rail as shown using an M3 10mm screw and M3 hammer nut. Assemble two top rear idler assemblies as shown. Insert an M5 12mm screw with hammer nut to fix the corner bracket to the rear of the frame. Insert an M5 50mm screw through the other side of the corner bracket, followed by an M5 washer, two F605Z bearings installed face to face, another M5 washer, an M5 25mm nylon spacer, an M5 plastic washer, and finally a large M5 hammer nut. Attach the Z-Max end stop into the position shown using an M3 10mm screw and large M3 hammer nut. Assemble two front lower Z belt idlers in mirror, one for the front left and one for the front right of the printer. Note each idler consists of two sub-idlers, the frontmost A and the rearmost B. Insert an M5 12mm screw into the front face of the corner bracket, followed by a large M5 hammer nut. Insert an M5 40mm screw, or A, into the other face of the corner bracket as shown. The M5 30mm screw, or B, on the left should be captive in the hole of the acrylic lower Z belt idler. To the frontmost idler A, insert an M5 washer, followed by two F608 ZZ bearings installed face to face, an M5 standard nut, M5 plastic washer, and large M5 hammer nut. To the rearmost idler B, insert an M5 washer, followed by two F605Z bearings installed face to face, an M5 standard nut, a flat T-slot nut installed with its neck facing inwards towards the bearings, followed by an M5 hammer nut. All three screws for this assembly are used to fix this assembly to the frame. Ensure the outer flat T-slot nut of idler B rotates flat against the 30-30 extrusion, while the inner hammer nut rotates to lock the assembly to the frame. This is a tricky part of the assembly, and it is very important that each of the hammer nuts is correctly rotated to securely fit both A and B idlers, as well as the corner bracket to the printer frame. Two top front Z idlers must be constructed in mirror to one another, one for the top front left and another for the top front right of the printer. For the idler itself, insert an M5 35mm screw into one face of a 30-30 corner bracket, followed by an M5 washer, two F605Z idlers installed face to face, an M5 standard nut, flat T-slot nut with neck facing inwards, and finally a large M5 hammer nut. To the other face of the corner bracket, insert an M5 16mm screw, followed by the acrylic corner spacer, and large M5 hammer nut. Position the assembly as shown and secure to the printer frame, again ensuring both M5 hammer nuts have rotated in their slots. Attach the hobbed gear to each shaft of the smaller NEMA 17 motors as documented in the extruder's own assembly guide. Fix the motors to the extruders, each with 3 M3 40mm screws. Insert 4 M5 30mm screws into the acrylic extruder carriage. For the front two screws, insert 2 eccentric nuts followed by a 4mm nylon spacer, small Delrin single V-wheel, and secure with nylock nuts. To the rear screws, insert a 10mm nylon spacer, small Delrin single V-wheel, and again secure with nylock nuts. Slide this assembly onto the 2020 extruder rail and rotate the eccentric nuts evenly on the left and right side to ensure the carriage runs freely. It is better here to have a little slop in favour of a free rolling assembly, as this component is literally pulled around by the X gantry and Boughton tubes. To the acrylic extruder cable chain mount, install 4 M3 10mm screws from the underside with small M3 hammer nuts on the upper side. Slide the extruder rail over the hammer nuts and secure the rail in place, ensuring all hammer nuts rotate in their slot. Insert M3 20mm screws downwards into each of the holes in the ends of the extruder rail. Also insert an M3 10mm screw into the holes in the acrylic cable chain mount as shown. Attach large M3 hammer nuts to each of these screws. These will be used to attach the extruder rail assembly to the printer frame. Now would be a good time to run the extruder wires through the extruder cable chain. Attach the cable chain to the acrylic extruder cable chain mount using M3 10mm screws with nuts. Secure the other end of the cable chain to the extruder carriage using M3 12mm screws with nuts. An M5 screw and nut is inserted and secured in the rear middle of the acrylic extruder cable chain mount to help guide the cable chain. Lower the assembly in place and secure to the frame, ensuring the hammer nuts rotate in their slots. Cut your Boughton tubes to length to ensure they are long enough to allow the hot ends to travel to the lower front and lower back of the printer. Insert the Boughton tubes into the push-fit adapters between both the extruders and the hot ends. Insert M3 10mm screws with hammer nuts into the position shown. Attach the electronics control board to the rear EE panel using M3 20mm screws. Use small nylon M3 spacers as standoffs to hold the board off the rear panel. Temporarily fit some M3 nuts to the back of these screws to hold the board in place. Attach the PSU to the rear panel as shown with M3 16mm screws. Again, temporarily attach some screws to hold it in place. Move the right side electronics enclosure into place, inserting captive M3 nuts into the position shown. Also insert the two AC covers into place. For the electronics board and PSU only, install M3 nuts onto the right-hand screws if looking from the front. On the rear of the panel, attach large M3 hammer nuts to each of the screws shown and attach the right side electronics enclosure with M3 10mm screws into captive nuts. Secure the rear and right panels to the printer frame, ensuring all hammer nuts rotate in their slots. Now is a good time to run the X-axis cables through the hanging cable chain. Fix the cable chain in position as shown to the cable chain mount using M3 12mm screws with nuts. Fix the cable chain to the rear electronics enclosure using M5 10mm screws with nuts. Pull the cables through the hole in the rear of the enclosure. Insert the rocker switch as shown. Insert captive nuts in the position shown. Attach the lower fan to the case using 6 32 by 3/8 self-tapping screws. Insert M3 10mm screws with large M3 hammer nuts into each of the holes shown in the left electronics enclosure panel. Insert remaining captive nuts into the left electronics enclosure. Attach the two AC IEC sockets to the left electronics enclosure with M3 12mm screws and nylock nuts, and secure the assembly to the frame. Insert 4 M3 20mm screws into the LCD panel, followed by 7mm LCD spacers as standoffs to the LCD panel, and secure with M3 nuts. Don't over tighten, it could damage the LCD. Push the encoder onto the LCD and lower the assembly into place, then secure to the captive nuts with 2 M3 10mm screws. Attach the 80mm fan to the upper enclosure with M5 10mm screws. These should self-tap into the fan housing. Insert the rocker switch to the electronics enclosure lower front. Using 2 M3 20mm screws and 7mm LCD spacers as standoffs, attach the SSR relay to the enclosure lower front as shown and secure with M3 nylock nuts and washers. Finally, attach the upper and lower front enclosure panels to the printer using M3 10mm screws into the captive nuts installed earlier. Proceed to the supplementary documentation for printer wiring and setup information.